Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr McGregor.
Thank you, Lord Brady. Ms Freeman, just before lunch we were discussing NHS Scotland Assure, and you said you didn't think that it was the complete answer to the problems that had arisen on the project. And we discussed some of the options in terms of taking that discussion forward. And you said that you didn't think you were really best placed to say what the ideal solution would be. I'd just be interested in your views if there was a discussion that had to take place around how should things be done differently and how do we really cure this problem, who needs to be involved in that discussion to shape the future?
So I think certainly the Scottish Government does and arguably should lead that discussion or initiate it. But it would be more than the Health Department. I think Scottish Government finance, the overall finance function, because one element of it, of course, is whatever funding mechanism or elements of funding mechanism might be settled upon. That would have a wider implication than health infrastructure. It would potentially apply to all public infrastructure. The boards, in terms of health, the boards themselves, but also I think we have Royal Colleges that are representative of clinical expertise in various areas. We would need it would need legal advice about what might be any legal underpinning to a new arrangement and what might need to change in current arrangements in order to allow any new arrangement to be in place. And then you've got just on the question of the infrastructure and the build, you've obviously got NHS Scotland Assure, but you have other areas of expertise within the health service and external to it. And I always think it's if you're looking at how might you in the round do things better, then it's wise to look at how other countries do it, including other parts, other nations in the UK, as well as elsewhere. You're looking at comparable countries and how do they organise matters and conduct these arrangements, and then see what might be possible.
Thank you. And in terms of your vision for NHS Scotland Assure, you were very clear in your evidence earlier today that you thought there had to be a physical inspection element to that, whether that's done by Assure or whether that is provided to Assure, but there has to be those physical checks that were done. In relation to NHS Scotland Assure, you've touched upon the issues about the legal framework that currently exists. Because of that existing framework, did you always anticipate that NHS Scotland Assure would have an oversight role in these projects as opposed to taking actual responsibility for aspects of the projects?
Yes, well, within the current arrangements, I could not see how they could take actual responsibility for the projects because of the legal position of boards as we've discussed. But I wanted their role and the use of NHS Scotland Assure to be more than voluntary. I wanted it to be a requirement that they were involved in everything about the build of healthcare facilities from design right through, and therefore there needed to be different bits of NHS Scotland Assure. I took the point, although the discussions I had were fairly early on before I stepped down, I took the point about being regulatory or not, and not over-regulating matters, but that is not the same as a Scottish Cabinet Secretary looking to NHS Scotland Assure for assurance that they can give or not give, but based on their expertise in whatever particular area it was, and their commissioning of actual testing of facilities, as you say, whether they do it or whether they get someone independent to do it, who's expert in whatever that area might be, that they can say, yes, ventilation, it does meet a standard, we have that assurance, and it has been tested as such.
Was there any thought given to whether the new body, the new Centre for Excellence, should have a regulatory function like the Health and Safety Executive that went in and did the physical inspections and signed matters off, or was that not something that was considered?
Excuse me, not whilst I was in office, because we were dealing with all of this, of course, in 2019 and then throughout, but the bulk of my attention from 2020 onwards was on COVID and our response to that pandemic. And that was the case for the vast majority of officials, including senior advisors in the Health Directorate. So there was a lot, although it appeared as a commitment to establish such a body in the programme for government in 2019, there was a lot to flesh out. And the nature of things is such that I wasn't overly involved before I resigned in the fleshing out.
Okay. If I could ask you to look to the target operating model for the new Centre of Excellence, which is in bundle 9, page 4. Were you aware of being involved in the discussions around the target operating model before you demitted office?
I don't recall that.
Okay. I'll just ask you to look at some aspects. If you can't assist the inquiry, then please just do say so. But if we could look on, please, to page 12. You'll see that there had been research carried out, and the research is recorded here. So it says our research, the user research sought to understand users' experiences, pain points of managing risk in the healthcare built environment, and what they want and need from the QHBE. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then there's the key themes. If you pick matters up approximately halfway down the page, skills and trainings highlighted, having experts available at the right points in the process, i.e. IPC, estates and executives, national and local. Then it says procurement, guidance, change control and governance. And you see at the bottom of the page, it says that a full summary of user research key insights can be found in Appendix A. And then if we look on to page 59, we'll see the user research, and it was just to pick matters up in the bottom box, which is headed procurement. Do you see that?
Yes.
So it says procurement. Current procurement processes are not fit for purpose. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you understand what that means, what the user research was showing there?
On the basis of that sentence, no, I don't. So there could be a number of interpretations of that.
Mm-hmm. What were your views on the procurement processes for these new build hospitals? Did you think they were fit for purpose?
I was not overly familiar with those, and in fact, during my term of office, I don't believe there were any new builds begun that would be at procurement stage. They were all in train when I became the Health Secretary, and any new ones coming down the line had not really begun.
Presumably, you make the fair point that really the Centre of Excellence, it's established in the programme for governance while you're still Cabinet Secretary, and then you leave office and it would be for others to take that model forward. Presumably, if NHS National Services Scotland has identified through user research that procurement is an issue and that the current procurement process wasn't fit for purpose, you would expect the Scottish Government to pick up on that and try to resolve any issues?
Well, yes, I would expect more information about, well, what actually were they saying? That's a synthesis of what was said. So in what way are the current processes not fit for purpose? And then a discussion about whether or not that can be remedied and improved.
And then if we look to the next bullet point, it says boards do not have ability to check what contractors are delivering. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And again, this is perhaps an issue that a number of individuals that have given evidence to the inquiry have highlighted, that you have a very simplistic model on one view, whereby there's the project agreement between the health board and the project company, but actually there's a web of contracts that sit below that the project company enters into, and you have the health board sitting really as a third party. They're very interested in what's delivered under these contracts, but they don't actually have any direct contractual relationship with the parties carrying out the works. Do you think that's a problem in these types of revenue-funded projects?
I can see that it can be. However, if we go back to what I said earlier, part of what I envisaged NHS Scotland Assure being able to do is, as I think they actually say on their website, align compliance with guidance from procurement all the way through. So that's where the expertise can come from. So I'm not expecting a member of a health board to be the one to go around flicking the switches and pressing the buttons, not least because they have got a great deal else that is important that they do. But I would, that is why, as one of the reasons why I thought NHS Scotland Assure was a good proposition. And I think, as it says in some of either there or in what you showed me earlier, almost a good proposition for all health boards, but particularly in some instances for the smaller ones, where they have less in-house expertise to draw on.
Thank you. And then if I can ask you to look over the page, please, to page 60, you see the top box says guidance. And then in terms of insights, it says guidance needs more teeth. Guidance needs to be clarified, and when it's applicable in full or where appropriate, there needs to be support on how to translate guidance in practice. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
In terms of this issue of guidance not having teeth, if your view is guidance equates with a base level of safety that would be expected in a modern healthcare facility, why are we actually talking about guidance? Why aren't we talking about a hard-edged legal standard like you would see in the building regulations, with the technical standards handbook that sits with it? You don't need to do that for every health facility. That might be impossible for old Victorian buildings. But why are we talking about guidance? If the guidance needs more teeth, why didn't the Scottish Government simply say we need a hard-edged legal standard for new build hospitals for critical building systems?
Well, during the period when I was in office, it was not appropriate at that point, on the basis of all that I knew, to say with absolute certainty we need a hard-edged standard, or guidance with teeth, if you like. My view would be that where we have best practice guidance, it should be mandatory unless there is evidence to make it exceptional in particular circumstances, and those would be circumstance by circumstance. That's my personal view. Whether or not government currently is seeking to give guidance more teeth, I can't comment.
That's understandable. And again, you might not be able to comment on this, but the inquiry's heard evidence from expert engineers who've said that in England and Wales, there's a procedure whereby you have the building regulations and then you have a set of documents called the approved documents. If you comply with the approved documents, you're complying with the building regulations. And the health technical memorandum, so the English equivalent of SHTM 0301, it sits as an approved document. Your personal view, not your view as a member of the Scottish Government, but in your view, would that type of model be something that that may merit consideration?
Yes.
In relation to potential reflections, we've discussed the issue of revenue-funded projects. You've said fairly that you're not really clear that you're the best person to talk about whether capital and build or revenue funded is the best model. Do you think one way of simplifying matters, though, would be to give health boards the ability to borrow funds so that rather than having to have a revenue funded model, they could simply borrow the money they needed, build their healthcare facility, and then you don't get into PFI, PPI, revenue funded, NPD? It would be a much simpler model for the healthcare provider.
No, I think a simpler model would be to give the Scottish Government the capacity to borrow funds greater than they currently have. Of course, a straightforward capital-funded project from government is simpler, clearer, arguably then easier to manage. It does not negate the need for the practice of governance, as we've discussed earlier, in any respect, nor does it negate the need for something like NHS Scotland Assure, but it is more straightforward. But in circumstances where that capital is not available and there is no capacity for government to borrow to secure additional capital, then when, on the other hand, you're faced with a need to procure improved environments for healthcare, then governments reasonably look at other models. But I think if you want to increase the borrowing powers of anybody, you increase the borrowing powers of the Scottish Government, because it as a whole is accountable to the Scottish public. And what you're talking about is public money, because borrowing money has to be paid, and that gets paid from the public purse. So I don't think it is the right answer to give those additional powers to individual health boards, but I think there is a strong case for the Scottish Government to be able to borrow funds for those purposes.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about a slightly different area, and that's about the amount of robust scientific data there is that sits below published guidance, particularly SHTM 0301. And if I could perhaps begin by asking you to look to Bundle 13, Volume 3 at page 553. So Bundle 13, Volume 3, page 553. So this is an older iteration of Scottish Health Facilities Note 30, version 3. So this is the 2007 version, not the 2014 version that's currently in force. And if I could invite your attention on, please, to page 576 and the conclusion section at page 5.19. This was NHS NSS's position in 2007. It said the integration of prevention and control of infection risk management and construction is in its infancy. It represents a significant change in the management of healthcare facilities design and planning, which will take time to develop to a level at which the greatest benefits can be achieved. Just as important, then, is the need to carry out research in the area of risk management, prevention and control of infection in the built environment to produce sound, irrefutable evidence on which to base further risk management strategies. Do you see that?
Yes.
So 2007, an identified need for further research to be carried out in this area. If I could then ask you to please look to Bundle 3 and page 185. Bundle 3, page 185, which is an NSS report into the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People in the Department of Clinical Neurosciences from the 9th of September 2019. And if we could look on to page 199, please, into paragraph 4.2.6. So what's stated in the NSS report is, from an infection prevention and control perspective, there is low quality to no evidence from outbreak reports and current guidance, respectively, to support minimum ventilation requirements. Therefore, it is not possible to make conclusive statements regarding the individual minimum ventilation parameters for inpatient care areas. A rapid review of the literature found limited clinical evidence to directly implicate air change rates alone in having a direct impact on the development of an outbreak or incidence of infection. Therefore, it is reasonable that in the absence of evidence, healthcare design teams should continue to adhere to current national guidance. In the event of a deviation from the current recommended ventilation parameters, design teams should ensure that air changes per hour are maintained as close as possible to the recommended air changes per hour without compromising other aspects of the ventilation system requirements. In addition, a full assessment of the services and patient population should be carried out and mechanisms for monitoring established. Caution is advised in relying on air change rates alone to provide adequate protection from infection. This is only one part of a multifactorial process involved in creating the appropriate airflow patterns with appropriate mixing and dilutants of contaminants. Nationally, further research is required to look beyond air change rates to examine the effects and other factors such as supply and exhaust location, door position and motion, spatial orientation, surface composition, temperature, humidity, and air distribution patterns have on particle migration in clinical areas. Do you see that?
Yes.
So 2019, there's a suggestion that really there's still poor quality data and further research required. Did the Scottish Government instruct any further research to be carried out in terms of the link between air changes and ventilation in relation to potential adverse clinical outcomes?
I'm afraid I can't answer that. It would be for primarily the Chief Nursing Officer's Directorate to pick that up. But of course, this is September 2019. By January 2020, we were dealing with COVID. And so that may have been an intention. I don't know. You'd need to ask other witnesses of that. But even if that had been the intention, it is possible, entirely reasonable, I would think, that it would not necessarily have been pursued given the entirety of our NHS, but that includes our Healthcare Directorate and government, pivoted towards dealing with the pandemic.
Entirely understandable, and you then leave office as Cabinet Secretary thereafter.
Yes.
But I'm really just asking for your observations. 2007, the guidance is saying there needs to be more research in this area. 2019, NSS are saying there needs to be more research in this area. If that research hasn't been instructed, do you think it now should be instructed?
Yes, I do, because I always think it's important to look for as much evidence as you can find to improve your learning and your understanding of any situation. Of course, the absence of that research, if indeed there is an absence of research and it's not currently being undertaken, and I do not know, doesn't negate, as indeed that paragraph says, the requirement to adhere to what is considered at the time as best practice. And the paragraph rightly points out that, of course, ventilation is not the be-all and end-all in the built environment in terms of infection prevention and control, but it is a critical element.
Thank you. Final issue I wish to ask you about at this stage is if I could ask you to have your witness statement in front of you, please, and if we could look to page 211 and paragraph 170. Page 211, paragraph 170. You tell the inquiry at paragraph 170, I think the Scottish Government has to move away from a notion of being arm's length to all of this, facilitating the funding, but basically leaving it then to boards to get on with it. I think that's unrealistic, but also wrong. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, we've talked about the discussion that generally maybe needs to take place, but in terms of the specifics, if there's going to be a change, what should Scottish Government be doing in the future that it hasn't been doing in the past in these projects?
Well, I think NHS Scotland Assure is part of what should be done. My own view, as we've touched on, is I do think there needs to be consideration given and discussion given to whether or not there is more that can be done to rebalance the relationship between Scottish Government and health boards without necessarily changing the legislative basis on which health boards exist, but also considering whether that is necessary. For the reasons that I state and I outlined earlier, as far as the public of Scotland are concerned, I believe, and I believe it is entirely reasonable, they elect MSPs to represent them. From that, a government is formed and individuals are given the honour and privilege of holding cabinet positions. That means you are accountable. You cannot be accountable for something that you are not in, as I say here, in the loop on. You absolutely should be accountable. What you do should be scrutinised and challenged. But to make that fair, you need to be involved. Now, that doesn't mean that a cabinet secretary should effectively be micromanaging every aspect of healthcare or every health board. That would seem to me to be foolish. But you can't have an arm's length position on something as fundamental to patient safety as infection prevention and control, which is fundamental in the built environment. And I think those are really important lessons. The built environment can't be ignored when you talk about patient safety. It is critical to it. It's not exclusive, but it is critical.
Thank you. Ms Freeman, the final question for me at the moment really is an open one. Obviously, you've had a lot of time to reflect on the project, the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People. We've covered a lot today. You've covered a lot in your two statements. Do you have any other reflections in terms of how these types of projects, new build hospitals, can be done better in the future to try to avoid some of the issues that cropped up on the project?
I don't believe I do, other than what I have said today about what I think should be considered, researched, worked through further. And of course, I am mindful that in saying all of that, I'm not the one who's going to be doing it. And that's a relatively privileged position to be in. But that would be my view. The areas that we've touched on today are the ones that I think need to be considered further.
Thank you. Ms Freeman, thank you for answering my questions. I don't have any further questions at this stage. Lord Brodie may have questions, or equally there may be applications from core participants, but thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Ms Freeman, really just on that last point, you see, I think you go the distance of saying you see a need to rebalance the relationship between Scottish ministers and the Health Board. Now, as you've explained to us, the 1978 Act imposes an obligation on Scottish ministers to, I think, promote a health service in Scotland. Now, what I'm interested in is frankly the mechanics of rebalancing. You don't go the distance of saying that there's a requirement to change the legislation. Is it simply a matter for Scottish ministers' decision to use or to make a more proactive, or I'm trying to avoid the word aggressive, but I think you'll get perhaps follow my thinking. Is it simply a question of Scottish ministers deciding to take a more, I'll use the word proactive, approach to the use of existing powers? Is that what you have in mind?
So, first of all, I'm not saying categorically that the legislation should not be looked at. What I'm saying is that that may be necessary, but you need to have the full consideration of all of the factors before you would reach that point. So there is, in my view, an imbalance in Scottish ministers being accountable in this area in terms of the delivery of healthcare, where in certain critical aspects of that, here we're talking about the built environment, Scottish ministers are arm's length from some of the critical decisions that get taken and assurance required in securing a built environment that is safe as it can be for patient care. There's an imbalance there in being accountable for something when you are at arm's length from it. Equally, there is a value in the local nature of our health boards. So I'm not suggesting centralising how we deliver healthcare. Part of how I think we redress that balance is through the creation of NHS Scotland Assure, in the way that I envisaged it and described it, where it sits, if you like, as the arm of independent assurance to government ministers about those critical decisions having been made. And it has some of its processes, the CASAR and others, that allow it to be at the table at those critical points, and therefore it should be able to give Scottish Government and Scottish ministers the assurances that are necessary. Whether there is more that needs to be done, I genuinely do not know, but my mind would not be closed to further consideration of whether there is more that needs to be done. And as part of that, whether or not there needs to be some amendment to that 1978 Act that gives Scottish ministers more powers rather than the exercise of the powers that Scottish ministers do have, and which I used during COVID, which is to put the NHS on an emergency footing. That is not something you want to be doing every day. But there may be some amendment needed to that legislation, but without full consideration and thorough discussion involving all of those parties I mentioned earlier, I couldn't reach a view on that at this point.
Thank you, Ms. Freeman. Now, Mr. McGregor has indicated that he has no more questions for you, but I want to just check with the room, as it were, if there are any other relevant questions that might be asked. Now, what that will involve is I'll rise for about 10 minutes and depending on discussion through Mr. McGregor, I will ask you to come back and either tell you that there are more questions or that there are no more questions. So if I could ask you to retire to the witness room.
Of course.
All right.
Mr. McGregor?
No further questions, my lord.
Right. Ms. Freeman, I'm advised there's no further questions, so that means you're free to go. But before you go, can I thank you for your attendance today and for the work involved in preparing your statements. I appreciate that. Would have been considerable. Thank you. And as I say, you're free to go.
Thank you very much, my lord. Thank you.
Now, as I understand it, Mr. McGregor, you don't have another witness today, but Mr. Maddox will be with us tomorrow?
Yes, my lord. Mr. Maddox first thing, and then Mr. Morrison after that tomorrow.
Right. So we'd hope to take two witnesses tomorrow?
Yes, my lord.
Right. Very well. Well, we'll see each other tomorrow, all being well.